because that song that I saw there was...
Okay. We're talking today with Mr. Herm Jongsma of Grand Rapids, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of Grand Valley State University. Now, Herm, can you start by telling us a little bit about your own background? To start with, where and when were you born?
Well, born, of course, as a Depression-era child, because in 1931 they were suffering the effects of that. And my father had to, based on the lack of work, move frequently. What sticks out in my mind is the fact that I had to transfer into numerous schools. Mm-hmm. And as an educator in the future, I came to appreciate the difficulties that accompany that for a young person. I went through 7 schools through my first 12 years of schooling.
Right. And where was it all in West Michigan, or were they farther afield from that?
First started in a suburb of Gary, Indiana, mm-hmm. and then from there we moved to Englewood, which is a suburb of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And from Englewood we moved to northern Oak Park, a western suburb of Chicago, and then to southern Oak Park. And in each of these, there were a number of schools that I ended up attending.
Okay. So in what year were you born?
1931.
Okay, so 31, so yeah, just right on time for all of that. And then as you're moving around, was there a particular kind of work your father did, or was just pick up whatever job there was?
Right, actually, I remember the horror stories that are accompanied, which are very pertinent to financial problems that our country faces mm-hmm. right now. And yes, he sold apples and bakery goods that my mother would bake on the mm-hmm. street corner. And I recall also that all the neighbors would go to the local little viaduct where trains would pass daily. Mm-hmm. And of course there were steam engines at that time. Right. And they all went out there with baskets. And the engineers on those trains would throw coal down along the sides. And everyone would scramble to get the coal and bring it back to their homes so that they could have heat. And those were just some of the things that I recall from my youth, and when my parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles got together and they would talk about these things, and the young kids would sit off on the side and absorb some of these stories that were taking place and the hardships that accompanied them. So anyway, after going through numerous schools and so forth, I think it was also important to stress the fact that my dad was a very religious man, mm-hmm. and we went to church twice a Sunday, which was common back then, mm-hmm. morning and evening. And another event that was kind of routine was my dad would always turn on WGN and have the Mormon Tabernacle Choir and the organ solos, etc., that they would play in their program when we got dressed to the accompanying music. I was deeply impressed with the quality of that music. That was phenomenal, a 350 voice choir, and I was exposed to that then. And with my father's persuasion, he in turn insisted that I join the boys' chorus at Oak Park High as my freshman year and move on to the a cappella choir in the sophomore years and so forth that follow. And without a doubt, you had to also participate in the church choir. Mm-hmm. So I was really immersed in that type of music, and that's going to have a very important point in my life when we get to the Korean War. Mm-hmm. So this at least takes us through the childhood years and so forth. I was a mid-year grad. People don't understand what mid-year grads are. At that time, you had 2 graduations from high school. One was in winter season, like January, February, and the other was the traditional June. I was a mid-year grad, so I graduated in January
What year?
1950.
Okay. Now, to back up a little bit, you were talking about the Depression years and so forth. Now, did things change once World War II started? Were there more employment prospects, or could your father get a
My
regular job?
father was very bright and was able to get into the business realm, and Radisco is one of the names I recall that he worked for. It was a refrigerator discount company or organization, and he got into the business realm. He worked for Sears Roebuck in Gary, and that was the beginning of the ladder stepping on upward. I think by the time we were up into high school, we were kind of middle-income family, and when we were getting into those high school years, my dad took a big jump off the bridge and proceeded to open a florist shop, and this was highly successful. And my mother is very artistic. My dad was also, and so I got exposed to that naturally, the delivery of those flowers and so forth.
Now, when that war was going on, were you paying much attention to it? Were you following the news or that kind of thing?
We had a guest seminary student stay at our home one summer, and I think it was summer anyway, when the United States actually got into the war and they announced it. My parents were already at the florist shop, and so as a young child I was exposed to them, and they announced that the United States was going to war. And this young couple that was staying with us and kind of overseeing us, they were flabbergasted. I didn't understand that at all. I was too young to appreciate what they were aghast at this announcement and so forth. And they listened to all of the news reports, and I watched that as a child. And of course, you equate it in your childish ways to athletic contests and so forth, and we want to be on the winning team and all of this, and you listen to the newspapers, I read the newspapers, and you listen to the news reports and so forth, and hope that your team was winning. You didn't really appreciate the numbers of deaths, etc., and what that impact it had. You got to know more and more about that as you looked around the neighborhood and saw in everyone's window either a blue star or occasionally a gold star, and indicating that the service person from that family passed away in war, and it started to hit you.
And you were, of course, also growing up at that point and getting older, and over the course of the war years, probably get a little better understanding of maybe what was going on, or how serious it was.
Definitely.
All right. But then it's over, and you can go on and finish high school and so forth. Now, what did you do then once you completed high school?
Well, that's interesting too, because obviously the curriculum in high schools at that day and age was very limited. You had a technical curriculum where the kids could go in and learn woodworking and shop metalwork and electrical circuitry and so forth. And of course, women, they could have homekeeping.
Right.
And my father said no to each of those, obviously. You're going college prep. And okay, I'm going college prep. So I took a college prep background. When I graduated in midterm or mid-year, early January, I decided that I was going to become a heating engineer. And the reason for that is in my junior and senior year, I worked for a heating engineer company, and that man that owned that company took me under his wing and sat me in the office at a drafting board, and I had to trace the blueprints for these homes and figure out the cubic amount of air in each room. And in addition to that, you also had to compute the square footage of each window in the house. Once you had all of those figures, then you can figure out what size heating unit would service that home. And the beauty back in that day is that the heating runs that went to each room were custom made. It wasn't pull it off the shelf, an 8-inch round pipe and send another heating run out. Each one was a specific rectangular shaped tube that went to that room to service the heating needs of that room. And I thought some of those things were neat. I loved math, and I saw, wow, math really does have a purpose in the real life. And so I decided I was going to do that. But when I graduated, I started working full-time for them, but you couldn't jump right into that trade. You had to serve an apprenticeship. No apprenticeships were open at the time, so I was waiting my time, cooling my heels, and working each day. One day I reported to work, and I found a new employee there. And I later learned in that day that he was now an apprentice. And to follow the story up, he was a nephew of one of the mechanics in the shop, and he had just come over from the old country. And so they pulled him in, and I learned a little bit about how political certain trades can be. And so I decided, all right, at the end of that day, I went home and announced to my parents that I was going to college. We will show them it's their loss, not mine. And no one in my family had gone to college before, so I was going to be the first one. I made application that evening or something and was accepted here in Grand Rapids. And
so what college were you going to then?
I went to Calvin College,
right.
enrolled there. One of the little verbs that occurred in enrolling at that school was that you had to have 2 years of a foreign language. And because my parents in turn transferred me from Oak Park High to Chicago Christian High at the end of my sophomore year, I had had 1 year of Spanish at Oak Park High. They didn't teach Spanish at Christian High, so I took a year of German. So I had 2 years of a foreign language, but they weren't the same. So I went into college on probation and started my training. I decided I was going to be a coach. Of course, when you sit down with a counselor, they set you straight right away. You're going to be a teacher, and you will coach on the side.
What were you planning on coaching?
I was active in track and also baseball, so I thought primarily in those sports. So they said you'll have to pick out a major, of course, and I picked out math. And being the first person at college and having whizzed through all my math courses in high school, I thought this will be a cupcake, and a piece of cake rather. And I got my first grade back at midterm, and I was really shocked. In my arrogant teen years, I looked at that, and I always told my students later on that when I got to that point, I said, obviously this professor hasn't gone back to look at my transcript from high school. If he did, he would have seen that this grade that he gave me was a mistake. Again, in my arrogant teen years, the solution to that was to switch majors. And in all honesty, I'm so thankful I did, because I went to my second love, and that was science, and I went into being a biology major. And I started flying through those courses. That's the time that it kind of hit me more about what else was going on in the world. and there were about 5 of us that were very patriotic and very concerned with this war in Korea, wherever Korea was.
Now, at what point in time was this? Was this 51?
This is
or?
towards the end of my sophomore year.
So,
So it'll be early 1952, the winter of 51. And we decided we were going to interrupt our college years and enlist. And I was going to go into the Air Cadet program. I had an older brother who had already gone through that and was an officer and navigator in the Air Force. He was stationed over in Africa, however, not in the war zone. And I thought this really was neat. I'd like to be a pilot or a navigator and so forth. And so I signed up for that. And a couple of days later, I don't know the precise time, but very soon afterwards, we were informed by the recruiting office that Truman had stopped all enlistments in the Air Cadet program. You could enlist in the Army,
right,
but the Air Force was off the table at that time. Well, I went home for summer break and was mulling this over in my mind. Now, what was I going to do? And I got a little letter in the mail. And Uncle Sam was saying, come along, you're going to go into service. And at that time I knew I had to quickly make a decision. You're either going for a 2-year hitch or you're going to go for a 4-year hitch. Would have been 5 years with the Air Cadet program, but 4 if you're going to enlist in the regular Air Force. And so I decided I'd go with the 2-year hitch.
So basically you were effectively drafted then?
That's it. I was drafted. I reported to Great Lake Naval Training Station where I was inducted. And a couple days after that, we were thrown on a plane over at Meigs Field. And from there, we took off and headed for California.
Had you ever flown before?
Never. This was my first flight.
So what did you think of it once you got up in the air?
It was really nice until we got into Arizona and we hit some very severe turbulence in this DC-3 or whatever it was. And boy, we were bouncing around like a rubber ball, and they had to make a forced emergency landing in some small field, and I don't recall what field it was at that time, regional airfield, obviously. And they couldn't make the first run, and they had to come back and hit the second run. I think when all of us got out of that plane, we were breathing a sigh of relief. And we waited it out for an hour or two, and then we took off and made our way over to California. And I was taking my basic training at Fort Ord. Beautiful setting, never been to California before. And the weather is fabulous. I went through that training, and I was scheduled to go to intelligence school.
Well, before we kind of go there, can you describe a little bit what the basic training experience was like at that time? What did they have you do, and how well did you adjust to it?
It was very physical, a lot of PT, and that was very effective. The running in between classes, the live ordnance that they used towards the end of your training and so forth, so that you made sure your head was down and so forth as they fired at a certain height above the ground. You didn't want to go above that. So we had that. I never really got fully trained in the use of bayoneting, the dummies that they had up there, and the swinging arm that you had to knock to one side and stab the straw-filled dummy. And I never felt very comfortable with that, but I felt it was very, very rushed.
Was it a 6-week program or longer than that?
8-week, I believe,
Yeah.
program, and then some of them were in turn shipped out from that point. Others, in turn, were fortunate enough to get additional schooling. In my case, when I wanted to go into intelligence schooling, I came down on a weekend with chicken pox. And that put me in the hospital where they kept me for about 2 or 3 days. When I was released from there, they would not let me return to my same basic training unit. You missed 3 days of training, so you got set back to another new unit, which was undergoing training. That was okay, fine, so we're going to finish up training. And when we did finish up training with that, I told the sergeant in turn, well, I'm scheduled now for intelligence school on such and such a place, such and such a date. And he said, ooh, I don't think you can go there. You have to have a leave. You have to go home. I said, we've got something like 7 days between the end of basic training and the starting of that school. It only takes me a day to get to that school. I've got plenty of time. No, you have to go home. And Uncle Sam insisted that you take a break and see your parents and so forth. I was very bitter and very upset. He said, well, we can let you go into a light mechanics school. You're definitely qualified for that. So I said, okay. I was disappointed for being let out of one school, but another school opened up, and I liked automobiles and mechanics, so I did. I went through that, and that was my MOS then as I finished up the training. I did have to go home and see my parents.
Did you do that training at Fort Ord or someplace else?
Yes, sir. At Fort Ord, the school, yeah, and that school was all that same military installation. So that wrapped everything up. Said goodbye to my parents in Chicago, went back, took that training, and from there it was Far East Command. That's what the orders said. Well, Far East Command, that's fine. That's Japan. You could be stationed at Japan. There were people there, and Philippines, and there are other sites over there. Oh, there's Korea too, but of course when you got to Tokyo and shaved your head again, they cut the new orders, and the new orders said Korea. And so we were loaded back on board boat and went around the Horn and over to Busan and entered Korea. And instantly we were put on a little single-railed railroad car that took us on up north. And at the end of that first day, I was in the combat zone.
All right. Now, at what point did you have your unit assignment? Was it made just sort of once you got there?
That's once we're in board the boat, they told you, okay, you're going to the 3rd Division. And it didn't say where, but you got that when you got to Busan. Busan, they told you you're going to the 15th Regiment. So you were shipped up to the headquarters company of the 15th Regiment, and from there you would be assigned to a particular company and whatever. When I did get there on that first day, it was towards the end of the day, and so they didn't process us much further. But when I bedded down that night on a cot over there by the motor pool, I found out, hey, they don't need any light mechanics here. We've got 4 or 5 of them already. Oh, yeah? So you'll just be probably running around here as a driver on call and so forth. Yeah, well, whatever. The next morning, when we were called out, I got my first introduction to warfare. We're in the combat zone, And while standing there with 3, 4, 5 other individuals, I heard this shout, "Incoming!" And everyone hit the ground and crawled to a ditch, and I was no fool. I did the same, whatever they were doing. We crawled to a ditch. And then I realized that those were incoming shells and the ordnance going off and so forth. And I said, there's one lesson we didn't really get much training in basic training. Incoming, I'll have to remember that. You hear that, boy, you're going to hit the ground fast. And what also amazed me was how they could detect that noise, that sound of an incoming shell, artillery shell, that it makes it through the air. Because after that had occurred and so forth, we got back up and got back to doing what we were doing. Things quieted down, and then I heard this noise this time, and I was ready to hit the ground and get out of there, but nobody said anything. And I looked around, I said, what was that? That's outgoing. And that really was an amazing thing, that these vets that were experienced up there, they could tell the difference between an incoming shell and one that is
So they wouldn't have heard the blast of the gun in the first place when it fired. It was firing from far enough away or whatever that
Exactly.
you wouldn't hear that, but you heard that the shell as it passed over.
Right. Well, that ordnance comes flying in at you from as much as 2, 3 miles from the enemy side, or maybe a mile behind you. But when it's passing over in the air, you still hear that whistle, and there's a definite difference in one that has reached its arc and coming down. There is no whistle like that with mortars. Mortars have a different trajectory, but these artillery shells certainly were ones that I quickly learned the word incoming and forget outgoing. You just shrug your shoulders and go on. So I learned that little lesson that day. It paid dividends also later in that day, because they asked me to very quickly take this lieutenant over to one of the line companies just down the road. And sure, the lieutenant jumped in my Jeep, and I took him off that way. And we didn't hear the sound this time, but we saw explosion in a nearby rice paddy field, whatever it was. And we slammed the brakes on the Jeep, and both of us dove into the ditch and alongside. And then the ordnance that were coming in, we could hear those. And the shrapnel from those explosions did a job on my Jeep. And some of that shrapnel was hot, still laying there on the Jeep after things quieted down. I took that. I said, okay. I put one of those pieces of shrapnel in a small box with some cotton and sent it to my brother over, who's cooling his heels over in Africa, and said, this is what war is all about. This one missed me. He was the only one that I ever had let know that I was in combat. So anyway, that was the end. We came back that day, and they assembled the 4 or 5 of us there. And one of the questions raised at the beginning of that little chat was, hey, we have an opening with the Greek army. Anybody here want to volunteer for that? I raised my hand, and all of the others looked at me, and all of a sudden I said, what did you do? You learned that way back in the beginning. You don't volunteer for anything in your service. And for some reason I raised my hand, and I was picked, and I was assigned then to the Greek Expeditionary Force, which in turn was attached to the 15th Regiment, 3rd Division in Korea.
Now, about how large was the Greek force, do you think?
The Greek force at that time was a battalion strength, and about 3 or 4 companies, I believe, and it grew up to a regiment, but that was post-war time.
So a few hundred men, essentially?
Yes, and they all speak Greek for some reason, and I don't. That was going to be one of the challenges when you get assigned like that. Fortunately, there were 4 other Americans, including the one lieutenant, but the other 3 were clerk typists, and they were going to just work in the tent there at the battalion headquarters. And so the only time I would hear English was with our small little group. It had some other nice benefits. We always ate in the officers' mess, and they treated us royally. Some other unique stories, too, associated with that is, yes, the food came from American Quartermaster Corps, of course, but there were 4 items that were imported directly from Greece, one of which was Elias. Those are olives, ripe olives. If you haven't ever had ripe olives, they're take a little getting used to, but once you get used to them, you become addicted to them. I did. I love them. The other, of course, was lathe, and that's olive oil. That's imported directly from Greece for the Greek soldiers, and that came in 5-gallon cans. And 2 of the other things, one was cognac, and that was 5-star cognac, and it also came in 5-gallon cans directly to the officer corps. And the other was ouzo, and that too was strictly for the officers.
Cognac and ouzo. That would seem like overkill. Now, was the cognac? Well, cognac should be French if you call it that. Or was it Greek brandy, or was it actually French?
Oh, this was Greek, and jumping way ahead, when the war is over, and I served another 6-8 months or something like that following the end of the war. The Greek unit was the place to go and visit by all the brass. They wanted to have their pictures taken there and that type of thing for their folder, whatever. And so we had many, many visitors. By that time, I was a very crude interpreter, so I would be assigned to some of the lower officers, captains or so forth, not the generals, 4-star or 3-star generals. Anyway, when the guests came, they were always ushered into the officers' mess tent, and they would be served cognac, obviously. Now, if you're familiar with that particular beverage, you realize that if you order it in a bar, you get a little cup like this.
Right.
I'm sorry. In the Greek army, you're served a water glass, and it's half full, like that. And the Greeks take great delight in serving that to their guests, and their guests would drink that. And they, in turn, would soon be under the table.
Right.
And the Greeks would not. And I'm told that that their immunity to that alcohol content was the fact that their food is just heavily laden in oil, which slows down the absorption of that beverage into their system. And the Americans didn't have that barrier. And anyway, they took great delight in that and laughed a lot about it after the visiting brass left, that they had them under the table again.
Okay, like a backup, what was your first impression of this Greek unit when you arrived there? How did they strike you, or what did you think of them?
Oh, extremely organized, very military, I'm going to use that label. They did whatever the officers said in a very sharp movement and so forth. And of course, I think you would expect that of professional soldiers, and these were professional soldiers. They were veterans, they were experienced veterans, and I attribute that obviously to being one of the reasons why I made it through that war, because these guys were accustomed to battle and war before they got to Korea. They had fought in their home country. I believe it's against the Turks and so forth.
Well, they would have had, there were civil wars in Greece after World War II, as well as all of the resistance activities and fighting against the Italians, rather, when they came in. So they may have, if they were old enough, they may have fought in the Second World War, and quite likely they were involved in some fighting communist rebels and things like that, too.
Yes. Yes, that's the, and we knew that they had experience, as I said, that this hand-to-hand combat and so forth, they were extremely skilled in that. And as I said, I attribute my being able to get through that in one piece and come back home to that army. And
now, what was your specific assignment? You were not a clerk typist type, so what were you doing?
we said we had to maintain contact with those on either of our flanks and so forth. The ROC group was on one end of the Third Division.
Republic of Korea.
Republic of Korea Army, and on the other was companies of the 15th Regiment. And so there was one officer assigned to the liaison crew, and I was going to go along with him. I would drive him wherever he wanted. I'd deliver messages with him and so forth. So we were constantly going up with the troops, etc., that were on the front. And theirs were, I don't know, they didn't open the package and show me all the papers that he was carrying to a command post, but obviously with maps and that type of thing, things that had been spotted and that they wanted the artillery in turn to center in on, and some things that they didn't care to get on the radio and transmit that way. They wanted direct contact. And then were messages being carried from the Greeks back to the related American units as well. The same reasoning being that this was a much safer mode of communication.
Okay. Now, what sector were you in, or what area of Korea were you stationed in at this point?
We were right behind Outpost Harry right from the start, and I earned my CIB in my first 30 days. This medal in turn requires 30-day under enemy fire, and so my first month I received that. We were under fire constantly from that. The real battles that were going to come shortly towards the end of the war were also on Outpost Harry. And I can enlarge a little bit more on my experiences there and my impressions of what war was really all about, at least for that segment. When we bring our story of the Korean War to high school students, I want to make sure that they understand that what I experienced is not what another vet that you're going to hear from has experienced. He may have been over on the coast, or he may have been up higher in the mountains and so forth, or he may have been in the Pusan perimeter and fought his battles there. This was a point when the lines were drawn and it was pretty stable as far as movement is concerned, or giving up when I was in that war. And it just so happened that this particular point called Outpost Harry was a direct access to Seoul, and the Chinese wanted that and wanted it badly, because from that position they could see the rest of the MLR, which was way behind us. They could easily cause you to fall way back to a secondary MLR and lose considerable geography. That explains why they hit us and hit us bad and hard and repeatedly. The warfare there is different at that time. The battles that were fought by the Greek army and the associated companies from the 15th Regiment, from the 3rd Division, took it hard, and they had some significant loss of life. That type of battle that was being waged there is one that had some, I call them very dark hours for me, and I use that word with dual meaning. They were dark emotionally, and they were also dark, of course, because that's the time when the battles would begin. Anything from 2,300 hours on up to 3 hours would be when that battle would be waged.
Well, the situation at this point is one where you've got both sides dug in and facing each other in the general vicinity of the 38th parallel, a little north or south, depending on where you are. Now, was it sort of World War I type kind of continuous trench lines? Or
yes.
Okay.
Good illustration, good example. The Outpost Harry was stationed out front of the MLR where the primary trench lines were, but there was a big trench line leading up to the top of this hill.
Trench or something like that. That's something that enabled you to move forward under cover, essentially.
To try to bring them supplies and so forth, you'd go through that trench line and get up to a couple of the bunkers that were up there with heavy weapons and so forth.
Now, a forward outpost, that's designed in part to break up enemy attacks, but also maybe to hold off attacks from several sides at once?
It's both of those. It is not the same as a forward outpost for the artillery.
Right.
They will have small little units that get stationed forward to set the coordinates for shelling, etc. And but this is much larger in scale. And anyway, as we're saying, these battles took place at nighttime, and I told my students that were relating these stories about Korean War that we were outnumbered 20 and 30 to 1, and that there's no exaggeration in numbers there whatsoever. And with that, and with the weapons that we were to use to defend that particular point, each wave got closer and closer to you. Through the concertina, there were bodies galore down below.
Concertina being the barbed wire.
Barbed wire. And those bodies would be draped over that, and each wave that came at you got closer and closer and closer through more and more of the barriers out there, through the minefields, etc. And so that the 3rd Division, when asked for the numbers of casualties that were inflicted on the Chinese in those 9 days of intense warfare, the numbers turn out to be 4,200 that were submitted. That's a large number of loss of life, and that's of the enemy. That's not the United Nations troops, the
And it
Greeks.
also wouldn't include whatever wounded were evacuated or anything else they took away.
Those would not include the wounded, right, exactly. These are
And about how many
KIAs.
men would have been in the front line in that sector defending?
Defending, 100, I believe, not much more.
Right.
And they would in turn be refreshed the next day
Right.
to replace those that were wounded and killed. It's mentioning the KIAs and so forth, I can jump ahead again, getting things out of order or sequence, but when the war is finally over, only 2 individuals were listed as MIAs from the Greek army. Only 2. Only 1 was listed as captured. And we're talking a battalion of Greeks that fought many battles there. That speaks to how fierce fighters they were. They would not give ground. They would give up their life before ever surrendering. 2 were repatriated. They were just dumbfounded because they only had records of 1 being captured. 2 came back. Anyway, back to my personal experience of that time in life. The darkness was there. It's preceded by a tremendous amount of incoming artillery. And when that starts to let up, you know in turn the attack is coming now from the foot soldiers. And you would hear those bugles sound. And I learned later that those bugles in turn were directing the enemy to move to the left, to move to the right, advance or fall back. All of these commands, and they were very well trained in that regard. As they got closer and closer, yes, they eventually did involve hand-to-hand combat. I've given credit to the Greek army, as I said, for saving my life, and I kind of, when the war was all over, carried that for many years, that why did I walk out of there without any wounds and so forth? Well, I personally have an explanation for that I'll share. While those darkest times were occurring, from out of a dusty corner in my brain, all of a sudden I recalled a song. Some of that music, that training and such an exposure that I had as a kid. A song I hadn't heard in years. All of a sudden it came back to mind. It was the Mormon Tabernacle Choir singing, "The Lord is my shepherd." That's the 23rd Psalm. And the 2nd and 3rd verse of that song hit me like a ton of bricks. And I knew I wasn't there by myself. And God got me through that experience. And I wasn't scared anymore. And any other activities that we experienced, it was okay. I just knew that song. And why that came back at that time, God knows, and I don't. But it came back, and it was very meaningful for me. And I tell you that too because when I did get out of the service and came back home, no one ever asked me one time anything about combat or my experiences in Korea. And I attribute that to being the forgotten war, but I also attribute it to the fact that I never told any of my parents anything in any letters that I sent home that I was in combat. I just made up little stories and sent something to them and signed my name to it.
So you were a mechanic, basically, so you drove people, maybe.
Right.
And
that's what they believed and so forth. They went to their grave never knowing that their son was in combat. And they lived to be 94 and 95 before they died. I was back home and doing some work in genealogy just a few years ago, and I was at a site in the Netherlands, which led me via a link to another site. And this particular lady ended up having some music listed on her site. And I went down that list, and it really hit me hard, because there it was, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir and 23rd Psalm. I downloaded that and sat in my office, really choked up. I burnt that onto a disc. Illegal, but I burnt it onto a disc. And my younger brother, who lives in the Grand Rapids area here, and I were going back to the Chicago area to see my mother, who was still alive at that time. And while he and I were driving back to Chicago, I took the disc out and stuck it in the player and played that song. And then for the first time in my life, I told a family member, and I shared with him. His jaw dropped. He didn't know I was even in combat. Now, be fair, he's my youngest brother. There's 12 years difference. So when I came home, or when I went to service, he was 9 years old. And there was a big difference in age there, so he never was inquisitive about it. I shared with him just a little bit of the stories. I will not get into personal detail on any my own stories, because as I truly believe, the real heroes, of course, are the ones that made the ultimate sacrifice. And if you want to hear some of the other personal stories, then I really strongly encourage anyone to go to the website called Outpost Harry. And you can look up the website, and there you will find one that is for the Greek Army, and you'll find one for the 15th Regiment. And a lot of personal stories are listed at those two sites about these battles that we faced.
On sort of a little bit more basic level, when you were with the Greeks at that point, were there then situations where you were kind of with them? Were you actually in the outpost itself at points when it came under attack?
Then one
and
particular.
So basically you kind of had to pick up the rifle and be there alongside them. Yeah. Now, tell me a little bit about some of the problems involved in trying to fight at night. I mean, one of them, the sheer numbers of them that got closer and closer to you. Were there issues with the kinds of weapons you had? Were they the right ones to have for that sort of situation?
I really felt that Uncle Sam did not provide us with the proper type of weapons. When World War II stopped, a lot of funding stopped all, and therefore new weapons and so forth were not purchased, and so they weren't there to be furnished. We picked up an M1 as the basic staple for an infantryman, and I have the utmost respect for that if we're going to go to a target range, and you and I are going to fight and see how many bullseyes we can hit and so forth, because it's extremely accurate if it's all sighted in properly, and it's a wonderful weapon that way. I tell high school students on our Tell America program for the Korean War vets that if they were to stand on the 50-yard line and I were to stand in the end zone, I would allow them to take one shot at me with a Chinese instrument, a burp gun. And then I get one shot at them with my M1. And I guarantee you that they aren't going to hit me, and I am going to take them down, or that person down at that distance. But the warfare that I've just described, of course, was not in daytime. And the Chinese weren't going to send a single shot at you. The weapon that they are using is a burp gun, and when they use it, it's And that ends up sending a wall of lead at you. They aren't going to be worried about a single bullet. And
it doesn't go in a single line the way a machine gun fire would, but rather it sort of sprays.
it's sprayed.
A shotgun or something.
Exactly, exactly. And that fit that type of warfare for them. Great. Nighttime, being up close, because they could get closer to you then at that, over in the cover of night. And then the type of weapon, they didn't have to worry too much about that accuracy. Later, I ended up getting a grease gun, and that's what we called it. And it sent 45 slugs. The weapon had a, magazine, thank you, of 15 shells. Now, so that's not that big, but it still had that burp gun effect. And I guarantee you that when a 45 hits you, if it hits you in the arm, even the hand, you're down. It doesn't have to hit you in the chest or the heart or anything else like that. It's not going to penetrate. It's just going to knock you so hard. So that was kind of neat. I carried that in my Jeep with me all the time and didn't want M1 if we were ever going to be intercepted out there on a road, ambushed. I had a weapon that was designed for that type of attack, again, throwing out a wall of lead and so forth. So, yeah, the weaponry was not suited for that type of warfare that we're talking about in the night.
Now, did the Chinese use a lot of heavy artillery or mostly smaller pieces? Oh,
towards the end of the war, yes. Yes, they brought in a lot of that. And the North Koreans had furnished the Russians had furnished the North Koreans with a lot of heavy weaponry when they started the war.
Right.
So they had tanks that were state of the art. They were the fearsome Tiger tanks that the Russians had that they had turned over to the North Koreans. And there was nothing that could defend against those when they first started that war.
Yeah, well, they had the T-34, which was the kind of the main World War II model. They also had more advanced ones. They called them Stalins or whatever. I don't know how many of those were there, but even the T-34, which gave the Germans fits for a long time, outclassed the American Sherman, and you really had to bring in heavier anti-tank weapons, or above all aircraft, to take them out.
Right.
Did you get a fair amount of air support? Were there bombing raids and things like
By
that?
By the time I was there, we ruled the skies, and that wasn't the case. But further up north, of course, they still encountered, the Air Force still encountered resistance from, but down on the main line of resistance, etc., we ruled the skies, or the U.S. did. And
now, could the aircraft actually do much good in terms of the combat, or was it more interdicting supply lines and hitting rear areas?
Exactly. They're as far as the warfare is concerned, at least, again, my perspective of it, and for the type of setting that we were in, no.
Yeah, that close together and at night. They would
The only jet I ever saw was when we had to make a run back to headquarters company of the 15th Regiment one day, and here came a jet flying in, and it was aiming straight down towards us, and you could see a bomb dangling underneath the belly of this aircraft. And he pulled up and flew off. Of course, obviously, reports were made of that quickly to the powers that be. Obviously, that pilot on his own saw this ammo dump area for 15th Regiment and assumed that it was Chinese or North Korean, and was coming in on a run to drop its weapon. Fortunately, it hung up on the belly of his aircraft. It never did hit the ground. It was the only weapon, it was the only jet that I saw in all my time over there in Korea.
All right. Now, during the months there where the war is still going on and you're in this assignment, did you get kind of rotated out of the lines periodically? Did you get any R&R time or things like that?
Good question. we took a very, very heavy hit in that time on Outpost Harry, as I've indicated. And so the 3rd Division was being called off of the line. That was a very unusual situation. When the Greeks moved off that Outpost Harry, I was there. They sang, and it so much as said, in your face. They sang as they came off this hill and down through the trench lines and so forth. They knew they were being relieved, and so they were coming back out, and they wanted the enemy to know it too. And we loaded into trucks and so forth, and I was in my Jeep, and we started heading back to reserve. And when we got about 3 or 4 miles down the road, military police were there at that corner, and so that way we had to very quickly go in to Chorwan because the Chinese had broken through one of Sigmund Rhee's crack rock troops or divisions, and that was another experience. As we traveled down, finally got into this area where they were sending us. All of the artillery was almost hubcap to hubcap. I mean, that's ludicrous, but no more than 6 to 8 feet in between each weapon, and it just went on and on and on. 155s, 105s, anything else that could fire shells were lined up there, and they were all letting fly. And we drove in front of that with all of that going over us, and that's lighting up the skies. And then we, of course, turned and went up into the mountains. That was another harrowing experience. Where are the friendly where's the friendly troops? Where are they at? Who's on your left? Who's on your right? Who's ahead of you? How far could you advance? I know we pulled up into this particular region, and the lieutenant got out and said, "Herm, you stay here. I'm going with so-and-so further." And I sat there and I thought, "Oh, right, I'm not going to sit in the Jeep here. I'll move off over here to this little side." Nothing really ever happened. That's the important point, but you're up there in the mountains, and everyone had just thrown their weapons down and ran. We drove past a little valley, a little swale in a mountain area there where all of the artillery weapons were. They were just left. It was completely empty.
So the Koreans had abandoned their guns?
Abandoned everything. They all. So fortunately we did plug up that hole. We were able to push it back to the secondary MLR. And then maybe 2-3 weeks after that, the Armistice was signed. That was another experience that was wild. All this artillery again was gathered, and it was as though they were going to say, "We're not carrying this stuff back with us." The sky was just full, and I thought it was so strange because it was noon hour, and here all these guys lined up to go down to the mess tent, and they had 20 feet or so in between each one of them. I said, "What are you, crazy? They're going to stop all ceasefire shortly, and you're going to stand there in line. They would fill your belly." And incoming were coming in. So no, I stayed comfortably in my foxhole and looked out there at the other troops as they stood there in line and listened to all of the other artillery going out. Anyway, that was the end of the war, and as I said, when that time came that they agreed to, it was silent from that point on. And then we did move back into reserve finally, and then it became occupation time.
So you spent how many months then kind of up in the front lines?
Oh, I would say 5 or 6. I think it was 5 or 6 months, and I never really figured it out and so forth. But yeah, it would have been a little. Come to think of it now, it would have been a little over 6 or 7 months.
Okay. But then you stayed in the Army, and you stayed in Korea for some time after the Armistice. So what then were you doing?
The Greeks imported more of their units, or they enlarged. Basically, we didn't have a great deal to do, but other than to entertain other soldiers, etc. We visited other camps, and we went around, and that there was nothing. It was dead time. I got to kill some of that time going on my first R&R. And I went back to Tokyo and went up to Mount Fuji and stayed at a lodge there and with one of the other fellows from that camp. And but basically, we really didn't serve much purpose there. I got to know some more of the Greek soldiers a little more personally. They were able finally to straighten out a flattened field and play some soccer games. I also experienced Greek Easters. The Greek Easter was, they imported lamb and they put it on spits and they roasted those lambs over fire. And oh, when they have service, you attend. You don't believe? That's, you attend. The entire Greek army marches at a brace up into their area. They have an altar set up for the Greek papas to lead the service, and they all stand there at attention for that entire service. And that's very moving to see that and how obedient they were. As I said, they march up there, they stand at a brace and so forth, and wow.
Now, did you see much of the Korean population while you were there, civilians or whatever?
Well, I had more time to do that type of thing, so I was able to get back to Seoul and take a few pictures of some of the buildings that weren't destroyed.
Right.
One of which is a historic monument there that the Korean people revered called the South Gate. We were able to take pictures of that. And I was also able to take pictures of the train station in Seoul that stays and is still there today. And had a very marvelous opportunity when we got invited back by the Korean government to revisit Korea. And we did that 2 years ago in 2006, late summer. And my wife and I went back there with 12 of us vets, and were the guests of the Korean government. They hosted us for 6 days and 5 nights over there, and it was very cathartic because I attended or went to one of their tours at a military museum. Wow. It's a lot of acreage devoted to that, with a lot of the weapons that were used in that war, but marvelous buildings. And they have dioramas inside there, one of which that really hit me, and it was a diorama of the wave attack. I had to take photographs of that. It was also very interesting that I was able to finally share a little bit of stories some 50 years after the war with other vets who were in the same boat. All of us were blown away when we went back there to see this country and where they were at that time. I believe it's their 10th or 11th and ranked in the world in world's economy, country economy. And to see the roads, to see the highways, the expressways, jammed with cars, bumper to bumper, and skyscrapers and things that none of these existed
Right.
back then, and how they had advanced in that 50-year period of time is unbelievable. The Korean people were just so thankful, primarily the older Korean people, okay? My wife and I took one afternoon away from the scheduled tours, etc., and went by ourselves down into Seoul. And as we were walking along, an older gentleman all of a sudden bowed and bowed again and smiled and bowed. I whipped off a real sharp salute. He was thanking us in his way for our service, and it was beautiful. As we were continuing to walk, I kept on hearing this little voice, hello, hello, hello. I stopped, and my wife and I turned around, and here's this little toddler, 4 years old, 5 years old max. He was speaking in English. So, hello, hello. And we found out, of course, that the Korean children are taught English in their school from a very early age. And their parents were so proud that we took the time to stop and talk to their son. And it was another really nice experience to come back there with another memory for our trip to Korea.
Okay. Now, when your time in Korea then was finished, you shipped home. Were you discharged pretty quickly after that, or did you have?
Yes. I think of the 2 years I got dropped off with 30 days early. I went back to the same unit where I was inducted and was discharged from Great Lakes at that point. I returned then to college to resume my studies. I was a different man, totally different man, with what I had experienced and so forth. I like to tell the kids, sports wasn't number one. I wasn't going on to be a coach. I was truly going on to be a teacher and coach if I had to on the side. And I couldn't get enough of my studies, etc., to satisfy that desire. So when I graduated with my bachelor's degree, I started teaching out in Southern California and in the suburbs of Los Angeles. And each summer break, I went on for additional graduate school training, Berkeley, for chemistry and some other Los Angeles, Long Beach State, and on and on. It came a point after about 5 or so years, and we had 2 children now, 2 sons. I said, I want to get my master's at least, and didn't know how I was going to do it because I was teaching in a private school. My first salary was $3,500, and that included being athletic director, head coach in football, and head coach in track. And those were like little $500 contracts added on to the teaching contract. So times weren't exactly very lucrative in that point in my life. I signed up for a National Science Foundation grant and about fell over when I was accepted for that. And we were off and back to my alma mater, University of Michigan.
Okay, so when you came back from Korea, you didn't continue at Calvin? You went to Michigan?
I went to Calvin and finished my work at Calvin, got my bachelor's there, and then I started teaching in Southern California.
Okay. So then when you're going out to Michigan, then on this, that was the first time you were studying there?
That was the first time I went full-time to the University of Michigan. Yeah. And that was a fabulous experience in getting my graduate degrees there. And I did research there. I was hired by U of M for research in electron micrography, and those were dark ages as far as that particular science is concerned, but they were state of the art at the time when we were doing that work. Fabulous, fabulous. Came back really enthused and ready to get back into the classroom, and I went back into high school level teaching as my primary job in Joliet, Illinois. And I taught there for about 29 years. I wore all the hats. I was classroom instructor first, then department chairperson for math science at very large high schools. Our 3 high schools in this district had 2,700 students at Central High, 2,400 at West, 1,800 at East. And in Illinois, that made up a school district. Right. And then after chairperson, I became a building administrator at Central High School. And I liked that for the ability to work on scheduling of students. That was my responsibility. It was really neat. Because we just broke into that field, and now we're scheduling 5,000 kids or so, and in my campus, 2,700 kids. And the part I didn't like and was playing super cop. I had 5 deans under me, and I had about 8 counselors under me for personnel services. I didn't like that aspect because I kept on coming home. I did a good job at it. School loved me. Everyone else said that was great. But my love was in the classroom and teaching.
Right.
And I thought, doing this isn't right. So anyway, I went back to the classroom. And of course, the other staff, faculty throughout the district really thought there was something juicy there that we can expose. Oh, what? And they dug and they dug and they couldn't find anything. And Herm just went back in the classroom for 2 years. And I taught gifted kids. And lo and behold, the summer phone rang. And they asked me to come back in to administration. They said, would you come in at district level? And I said, yes, I would. I thought I had something that I could offer there because I was going in curriculum. And so I went back in, and for my last 11 years there, I served in district administration. While all of this is going on, I also served, I also taught at a small university in Illinois, anatomy and physiology, and I also taught at a 3-year nursing school. Actually, it was attached to Joliet Junior College, and my students, because I was teaching only part-time at that level, were about 90% of them were all RNs coming back to get their bachelor's degree. And they were highly motivated. It was a fabulous time. I loved those classes at Lewis University and the others at Joliet Junior College. That was great.
All right, and then you decided to retire to Michigan then?
Come back to Michigan, where I have a younger brother and so forth, and my wife was from this area in Michigan, so we knew this area quite well, having gone to Calvin prior to that time, so yes.
And then with the Tell-America group, then part of what you do is go around and visit high schools and try to explain something to
these kids.
A
marvelous
what going on.
Opportunity to get in and share with students nowadays about that particular war. I feel that I can open up a little bit, and I won't go into personal stories about my own experiences and so forth. Those heroes that we will talk about, and that gave their life in there or were severely wounded and so forth, they deserve the credit. We also want students to know why. Why were we there in the first place? And I find that most adults can't even answer that question. And it's great to be able to tell you, well, kids, I want you to understand why we're there. And I want you to understand that you have to go back in time to appreciate why this Korean War was started. And first, you have to go back to at least 1910. And 1910, I tell them, you're going to find out that Japan came into Korea and they took over that country. They annexed it, if you will, to their own. Those were terribly hard times. And I tell the kids, no, I'm not that old. That was when my parents were born. But that was a time when that country was taken over by Japan, and they ruled it harshly. I said, they did that for 35 years. And I said, now, if you push that ahead to 35 years, that brings us up to what? 1945. That's right. And then I tell them in turn, remember what happened then? That's when, the big bomb. And 3 days later, boom, another big bomb. And 2 cities were wiped off the map. And I said, now, finally, Japan was going to surrender. And you know, just a day or 2, maybe 3 at the most, before they surrendered, Russia finally gave in and said, they announced that they were going to be at war with Japan as well. And they had been asked to do that sometime, for a long time. Anyway, they came in, and when the war was over, they entered North Korea from the north to supervise the excavation of all the Japanese troops in the north. And the United States quickly came in on the south, and through mutual agreement they decided the 38th parallel was going to be the dividing point, and we would handle all of the Japanese troops that were in the south, and you handle all of them in the north. And we watched, of course, as after that had been accomplished, as Russia proceeded to train all of the North Koreans and militarily, and to start to furnish them with all of their weaponry and so forth. And the United States kind of stepped in the South and said, let's let the people have an election, and let's let them set up a government, and let them in turn pick their own leaders. And it was interesting to have to go around to the people and say, you're going to pick your own leaders. What do you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, 35 years, folks. These people that in turn have been under domination of the Japanese people never were able to do this.
And they were a monarchy before that. So.
Exactly. And so this is totally new to them. Russia said, no, we're not going to have any elections. We've got a lot of collaborators up here in the north that were helping the Japanese and so forth, and we're not going to go along with that. We'll handle that up here our own way. And the United States said, okay, turned it over to the UN. UN did conduct elections in the south. Russia did not permit the North to participate in them, and so the country was divided. And we tell this to the kids, oh, I understand now. Now it isn't. North Korea, South Korea, those aren't 2 different countries. That's all one country, but they were divided because of this domination of their country by Japan and so forth, and then the effects after the end of World War II. And anyway, it's fun to be able to to kids in the classroom and share some of these stories. Some of the members of our group in the Korean War Vets Association have some really great stories to tell. We have one, of course, that was a prisoner of war for 33 months, and he's got some stories that makes your skin crawl as to what he experienced, and the death march and everything else. So,
Well, it's very good work that you're doing, and I just want to thank you for coming in and sharing some of this stuff with me.
well, thank you.
All right, that'll do it. And we just turn off the mics. There. And there.
Like this.
Let's see. So